Christchurch, New Zealand. Its nickname is the Garden City. Postcard images of Christchurch are very quiet and tranquil and pretty. Most of the gardens, the flowers, the trees are English imported, English colonial trees. They're not actually native or local to the place. So it's a town of 500,000 people. It was first settled by the indigenous Maori in about year 1300, and the English arrived in the mid-1800s. And the architecture in the place is an importation of English architecture, and even the city plan and the names of streets were drawn by someone in England who had never visited. Historically and up till today, agriculture is the predominant industry, followed by manufacturing, steel, and actually the textile industry. And now tourism is a very important part of our economy. Christchurch is just like a small English town from the 1950s. And instead of showing you images of the destruction, I quite like this image because it's a metaphor in a way that a lot of the straight lines in the place suddenly got a bit wavy, and things, the whole culture of the place started changing. So 7 years on from the earthquake, it feels like a very different city. The most popular bar in the city is an old school bus converted into a bar. They have a motorbike repair shop inside the bar, so people will be working on their motorbikes while they're drinking at the bar. And Christchurch has become the Australia-New Zealand capital of street artworks. And the most popular government project since the earthquakes has been a giant playground. Even the local government has developed a sense of humor where the traffic barriers now they put in place when there's road construction and things, they made sheep. There are more sheep in New Zealand than people. And none of this feels like it would have happened in the Christchurch of 7 years ago. See how spread out Christchurch is across the plains and how low density. But this is actually an image taken 30 seconds after the largest earthquake, and the smoke you see is actually the dust from all of the buildings rising up as the city is being destroyed. And the whole central part of the city was shut down behind a military cordon for 2 years, and they demolished 2,000 buildings. So you see, these are entire city blocks where there used to be 100 buildings. There's now 2 or 3 buildings left standing. Self-guided audio tour of a neighborhood in Christchurch where we interviewed lots of people about their memories of the neighborhood, old buildings and shops and restaurants that they used to hang out in. We talked to homeless people living on the street there and academics who were studying the urban planning of the area, and we stitched it all together into a guided tour where people would put on headphones and be told walk 2 blocks and then stop, and they'd be told a story about that. We tried to get a real mix of perspectives, so it wasn't only about history and remembering the stories. There were also some people who shared a lot of the anger about the government's recovery plan for the city or the lack of development or whatever, and we tried to share kind of many different views. One strand of that resulted in a series of projects we called Diversity, where we approached cultural societies and different ethnic groups within Christchurch and worked with them to develop projects. So our only demand from working with these cultural groups was that we create an object that would go into a public space for 6 months, rather than being just a festival there for a day or a weekend. So coming right back to our very first project, this very simple project took us weeks of work to do. I say 90% of the work that was involved in the project you can't see in this picture because it was paperwork. So alongside Gap Filler, some of us created another organization that we call Life in Vacant Spaces. And rather than creating projects, they are what we call the Bureaucracy Buster. So Life in Vacant Spaces get to know every property owner in the city and try to borrow their empty spaces. And they get to know all of the city government permits and regulations and requirements and how to get around them or how to get through them very quickly. They get to know all the insurance requirements and basically do all of the really boring stuff that nobody wants to do. The basic curatorial practice for Life in Vacant Spaces is they will support almost anything. But it's not for us to decide what's a good idea, what's a bad idea. If someone comes with an idea for some community-minded project, whatever it might be, Life in Vacant Spaces will try to support them. Everything from a room full of Lego blocks that kids can come and play with, to outdoor markets, to vintage clothing shops, to urban farming on vacant sites. And while Gap Filler has created quite a few projects over the years, Life in Vacant Spaces has been a broker or a facilitator for more than 300 projects. And so we often talk about the importance of having both quality projects but also a quantity of projects. So Gap Filler does some big scale projects that are more significant than a lot of other groups can do, and we get some international attention. And at the same time, Life in Vacant Spaces is just helping so much stuff happen that as you're walking around the city every block, there's something happening that starts to create the perception that, oh, this is a place where I can do something. This is a place where things happen. And those work hand in hand very well. Where we started exploring what you are allowed to do without needing any permits. So we built a small building out of waste materials from a house that was demolished. We didn't have to connect to the power grid. We put solar panels, so again, no paperwork. And we put that on a very prominent vacant site so that people would see it and ask questions and say, how did you create this? And we could tell everyone, you don't need any permits. We and a lot of other people started exploring these rules and finding the gray areas. So it says specifically if it's under 10 square meters of floor area, you don't need a permit, but it doesn't say if you have an extra 5 square meters under a canopy, but it's not technically, inside a wall. So we built this structure and no one complains. We needed no permits. So then we try the next one and the next one, getting a little braver each time. And this particular project is one we bought a bunch of bicycle tools, and it's a community bike workshop. So we ran it as a Gap Filler project for a year where anyone could come and the volunteer mechanics would not fix your bike for you, but would teach you how. Say, oh, here are the tools that you need to use, and this is how you fix your own bike, and watch you do it and correct you until you learn. And after about 2 years, there was a really strong same community of volunteer mechanics who would turn up all the time. And so we sold the building and all the tools and everything to them for $1 with a contract that they had to keep it open as a free public space. And we got a bit bolder. There's a rule that says you don't need a building permit to create a pergola, like a small garden structure that people often put in their backyards. But the published rules don't say anything about how tall or how big a pergola could be. So we proposed this project. So this was a particular controversial site. So this is publicly owned land, and this used to be a public walkway. And in the 1980s, they sold this site to a developer who built a giant hotel that cut off the public access way. And after the earthquakes, the hotel was demolished, and we wanted to make sure that they didn't, again, allow someone, a developer, to build across this public walkway, so that's why we created this, we call it arcades. For 4 years now, people have been using this walkway as a pedestrian and bicycle way. Last year, the government put out their new land plan, thing like that, and they are now selling this piece of land in 2 separate pieces with a public walkway down the middle. It's designed not only as a walkway, but as a space where we have pop-up markets. There's no school of architecture architecture in Christchurch. But there were so many interesting experiments in architecture happening there that all of the architecture schools around the country and the architecture schools in Australia started taking field trips to Christchurch. And so a group of us put together a new festival. A few classes of architecture students from each of these schools would spend a whole semester designing and building a project to be delivered in Christchurch over one weekend as part of a festival that we're creating. So Life in Vacant Spaces would find all of the land from the landowners and get all of the permits, these did need permits, and get all of the insurances. And the architecture students would bring, actually in their suitcases, all of their materials for their projects folded up. And Gap Filler would get support from the power company and the construction companies. So these students would bring, just a strand of lights. But when we got support from the crane company to have a 40-meter crane suspending the strand of light, suddenly it creates a very big and impactful festival with very little money. And in a way similar to what I was saying about having quality and quantity of projects, it's also very important to have small-scale projects local to a community and occasionally some really big-scale projects that get a lot of attention, and that this diversity of projects attract a lot more people. So we started reaching out to property developers and asking if property developers wanted to partner with us in some way on their development projects, and everyone said no. Part of the government's recovery plan for Christchurch after the earthquakes was to increase the urban density and to get more people living in the city. And they proposed an area of 6 city blocks that would be medium density apartments. And the government bought up all of the land, and the government put out a tender and awarded the contract to one developer who's the biggest developer in the country. And so these are some early concept drawings from the developer. So this is medium density by Christchurch standards, much smaller place. So 3, 4, 5, 6, and up to 7-story apartment buildings along a sort of public park. But the government required the developer to spend 0.1% of the development budget on community stuff. And that 0.1% is still far more money than we'd ever seen before. So that developer paid us to put together a program of recommendations for how they spend their money on the community stuff. So we did a lot of analysis of the city and put together a big fancy sort of proposal document for some temporary projects we could do that would also learn a bit and maybe influence the longer term development. And we talked a lot to the existing community, and probably the single strongest point of view we heard was this fear that the developer would treat this as a blank canvas and not recognize the current neighborhood and the history of this neighborhood. So as one example of a project we proposed, there's a company that runs mini golf courses in the city, and they wanted to build a mini golf course in this area on one of the sites that's not going to be developed on for 5 more years. And we were in this funny position, our little community group, where we are the gatekeepers for the land. So we told the company, yes, you can build your mini golf course if you make it heritage themed and you tell historical stories of this neighborhood. The local government had actually preserved bits of the buildings that were demolished after the earthquakes and had them in a storage yard. And we've borrowed bits of the old buildings. The mini golf course, this just opened 3 weeks ago, so this is brand new for us. And so this, for instance, was the ventilator shafts, ventilator towers, the original public library in Christchurch that was 2 blocks away from this site. And so they're incorporated as sort of obstacles and decoration in the mini golf course, and then as you're playing at each hole, there's a sign that tells you a couple paragraphs about the history of that building. And it's been so popular that already the developer has said to us, oh, do you think we could maybe have some of those pieces of the old heritage buildings to incorporate in the new apartments when we build them? It's entirely out of our control, but we're trying to influence the permanent development to come later to instill a bit more community values and respect for the history. This is also part of the same program, a new area for local youth. Again, the government and the developer required a certain amount of this land to be car parking, service the commercial businesses operating in the city. So we proposed that we would run the car parking with our local community groups, and we would make the sites look nice and put nice landscaping in, and that every dollar that we make from paying people to park there would go into the youth hub space right next door. So this just opened last month, but we are now making 6,000 NT dollars per day, which is a lot more than what our normal entire annual funding is. A big group of us just got together to create a new property development company, and we haven't actually developed any property yet, but we're looking to do community-minded property development, and we've got high-flying lawyers and financiers and property developers and people with a lot of community experience all trying to work together to figure out ways to have better community outcomes in property development.